Well, hello and welcome to the Citylit Mental Wealth Festival 2025 and this very special live recording of the Proper Mental Podcast. We're going to talk today about being a man, contemporary masculinities and how these things relate to mental health. And obviously joined here today by Sam and Sean. And what I thought we'd do today to kick us off, fellas, is when we talk about masculinity, it's a very vague term, I think. I think it means different things to different people. I think it means different things depending on the context. And it's kind of like bolted on as like the root cause of everything that goes wrong with men's mental health and all sorts of all the man-related stuff, really. So I thought what might be useful to kick us off today is if we try and kind of, just a bit of table manners, really, just to kind of make sure we're all talking about the same thing and we're all on the same page, is try and kind of define it a little bit. Which I know is a big clunky question, but we'll have a go and see where it goes. But Sam, when I say like masculinity, how do you define that? What does that mean to you?
Well, I don't think there's any such thing as masculinity. To be honest, sorry if that blows the whole.
And we're off.
So let's just go. No, I think masculinity to me is, me personally, I think it's always had like really corny kind of connotations that are a bit cringy, because I link it wrongly or rightly to sort of ideas of being sort of macho, which, you know, when I was growing up in the 80s already seemed really dated, you know, sort of a throwback. Blokes who wanted to sort of be macho and tough and strong and all those other things. I sort of thought, you know, any bloke, it's fine for some blokes to be like that and some blokes aren't, and, you know, most blokes are a mix of all different sort of characteristics. And the idea now, when I hear people talk about masculinity, it's always as if like we're born with a set of traits that are different to other genders, which I don't think there's much evidence for in evolutionary or scientific terms, or culturally when I look around me either. But I think there's a scam that is sort of been generated by different facets of society, not least kind of marketing, and nowadays online influencers who are grifting to try and sort of tell young men that they can teach them what masculinity is, that they've sort of created a notion that's a very narrow definition of what a bloke should be. So I think it's like, to me, I always thought it was a cringy term, and now increasingly I think it's a marketing scam. That's what I think masculinity is. Because I think that actually there is no masculinity. I think, you know, there is only being human, really, and there's a set of characteristics that most people should, broad values and characteristics that most people should aspire to, irrespective of their gender.
Yeah. Okay. What about you, Sean? What's your take on masculinity? What does that mean to you?
I suppose it's a social, cultural, and political understanding of what it is to be a man, someone's own internal compass versus the external pressures of what it is. That's how I typically define manhood. But there are scientific differences between men and women, and also gender is obviously it's a whole different conversation. That's not to be controversial or antagonistic, but some cultures value things differently. That's why culture is quite different to politics, or politics is different to what happens with certain things, biologically speaking. And there's a really good book called The Blank Slate by Steve Pinker. Once upon a time ago, we had this idea that babies were born complete blank slates, that they were absolutely malleable, and babies are malleable, young people are malleable, but there are some distinct traits and qualities people are born with. But the idea is you can load a bullet into a gun. Obviously, it's a really morbid analogy, but it doesn't mean it fires. That's down to culture, that's down to maybe certain life events that might happen. It could be your food. There's a lot more that happens around it. So for me, masculinity is social, cultural, political expectations on top of the internal compass that we have.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really interested in how, because if we're thinking of it as this, I suppose how I think of it is this, like, I don't know, almost like we opt into something. Excuse me, we opt into something, right? There's this sort of programming. We're sort of told that men are supposed to be a certain way or have certain characteristics. And I'm quite interested to think like where that comes from, because I think it's like subtle. So when we say culturally, what are we talking? Are we talking like, is it media driven? Is it, what sort of different aspects contribute to building this picture of what makes a man?
Well, I mean, I think obviously it's multifaceted. My own experience of growing up is that I grew up in a very sort of male, traditionally blokey working class environment where there was a sort of a sense that being a bloke meant that, I mean, one of the key things, aside from all like the sort of cliches, which were true in my life, like, you know, football and the pub and all that, and talking about girls and that sort of like, you know, traditional sort of corny blokey banter, which I grew up around. But there was also just like the general sense that you don't take much seriously, especially yourselves. I mean, that was partly my generation. But it was also, you know, felt like part and parcel of being a bloke. You don't whinge, you're quiet, you don't navel gaze, you're good humoured, you take the mickey and you live life in a sort of, you know, straightforward way. And I think, you know, with relation to mental health, that's a problem, because I grew up under those influences. I sort of probably grew up that kind of bloke, and then what you do is you neglect yourself. You don't really sort of understand who you are because you're conforming the whole time to something that's been fed to you by those around you. And yes, I also think that maybe politically, certainly culturally and socially, those things are sort of compounded as well. A simplistic idea of who you should be and the role you should play, which means you don't pay much attention to your own sort of your real self, and you don't pay much attention to your own feelings and your own mental health and what makes you happy or sad. You're just conforming, largely as a result of, I think probably principally your peers. So in my case, I grew up in a house with a single mum and three older brothers. And so that was, you know, and it was a very blokey atmosphere. And then when I went to school, it was similar. And then even when I started working, you know, I worked in men's magazines in the 90s and the noughties where we were sort of promoting this idea of sort of a cliched idea of masculinity. So I conformed to it even more and more, you know. And by the way, all of those things that were part and parcel of that, I still, you know, I haven't rejected all of those as I've got older and slightly more self-aware of my mental health. I still enjoy certain aspects of it. I certainly still go to football. I don't drink, but I still go to the pub and all the rest of it. But perhaps I realised that, you know, those sorts of ideas that were sort of force-fed to me are not necessarily the whole story about who I am or the roles I'm supposed to play.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Do you relate to that, Sean, as well? Like, can you think about when you were a young man growing up, what sort of things are like feeding into the system that's trying to tell you how to behave and how to think and how to act?
Yeah, absolutely. I think masculinity, especially within the working class black community, very similarly is attributed to the idea of how many women can you get, or how much money do you make, the kind of career that you take on. Certain careers are seen as more inherently masculine than other careers. I definitely grew up with a certain particular idea, and I grew up, so my father died on Christmas Day when I was 6, and my aunties helped to raise me, so I often say I was raised by a village of matriarchs. So I was quite immediately exposed to the idea of what it meant to be emotionally literate, the idea of how I could speak about things. But I learned quite quickly in school that's not how everyone was. It's not where everyone wanted to be. But I do think to some degree you conform. And then I think as you get older, you start to have a different internal compass, which guides you a lot more rather than what happens out there. But I think, touching on one of the points you made earlier, Sam, that I do think masculinity has become a marketing scam. I believe it's become a one-stop garage now for young men to funnel into. I think influencers and coaches are some of the biggest scams we ever have now on the internet, where there's no backing behind them, there's no credibility, but they're leeching onto young men's pain. And being 31 now and being a millennial, I think if I was to be born in the generation now, I probably would have been part of that marketing scam as well. So I think it's really important to make that distinction between when I grew up as a man, my pressures were completely different compared to what the young boys and now I've grown up with.
Yeah.
There's something, just something you said that was really interesting to me. You said, yeah, because you were raised like by women, you were quite emotionally literate, and I thought to myself, I was quite emotionally illiterate, right, when I was young, probably because I did have a my mother raised me, but I was also raised by 3 older brothers, really, and she was working, not around so much. And what's interesting, you say you go to school, and you realise not everyone was the same, or not everyone wanted that. And that's really interesting, because any elements of emotional literacy I did have, I remember, I can remember specific moments where especially when I got to secondary school, I actively like hid, and then like my son, who's 13, I would say that he is much more emotionally literate than I was at that age, like a million times more. And he's found school a lot harder than I did. And it's because I don't think he's willing to hide that side of himself. So it's still happening now, but it's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if that's what you meant, like you go and you were aware of the fact that you were more emotionally mature, you were sensitive about certain things. But at school, that's something that to a degree, as a young man, you learn to hide, which is a real shame. And that kind of loops into what you're saying about these, like, you know, the influencers and the people sort of peddling these sort of narrow ideas of masculinity, because I suppose they're tapping into that and saying, you know, that's what you should be doing. It is unnatural to be emotionally mature. It is unnatural to feel sensitivities. Ignore that side of yourself. Lean into the more, I don't know, Neanderthal side of yourself, I guess. That's what a lot of these people seem to be doing.
Yeah, I definitely would say going to school, I learned to understand knowledge wasn't really appreciated, but within particular communities, so to speak. And I think there's a lot of other reasons for that. And I'm not trying to say it's nuanced as a cop out, but there's so much to unpack there. I definitely think for myself, I was quite sensitive. I thought about things quite profoundly. I'd look up at the ceiling sometimes before going to sleep and just think about stuff, to the point where you wake up and you're like, wow, it's 3 o'clock still. And I think for a lot of the young boys growing up, they only cared about entertainment, money, and women. And I work in mental health, and I've seen a lot of the effects of what's happened to a lot of these young men who have ascribed to particular ideas. And I think it is back to the idea of some men are not willing to hide anymore who they are. And I think that takes a different type of strength. And we associate physical strength, the raw physical essence of strength, as notion of masculinity, but I think a big notion of masculinity is to be able to lead with your own sense of what it is to be a man, which I think is really important, especially for a lot of young boys now.
Yeah, very much so. Something I'm very conscious of today is to kind of, we're going to talk a lot maybe about our own experiences, because I think that why we are here to talk about being a man, we are just 3 men and we don't represent all men, right? And I think a big problem with the conversation around men's mental health is we often tell men what they should be doing without thinking about who that man is as an individual. So I will talk about a bit of our experiences, and I'm going to take it towards mental health in a little bit. Before we get there, you talked a little bit about how that felt like, you know, at school and like growing up, to be resisting maybe those masculine norms or leaning into those masculine norms and playing around with that. Now that you're, you know, quote unquote grown-ups, do you ever still feel that pull again, right, of like this unwritten rule of masculinity? So I'll give you an example from myself. You know, I've done loads of therapy. I'm very self-aware. I kind of have an idea of the type of man I want to be and work towards and all these sorts of things. And I'm comfortable in myself and I'm confident and it's all great. About once a year, when I take my car for an MOT and I'm in a garage full of mechanics, I feel less of a man, right? And I take my car in, and there's this, you know, knowing about cars and how to fix them is such a manly trait. I couldn't fix a car. I couldn't put a shelf up on the wall, right? And the guy that takes my keys, he's got those like really thick hands that comes of years of masculine manual labour, and mine are like skinny and smooth. And he's got oil under his fingernails and grease on his top, and I've got like a bit of ink and maybe some crumbs on me, you know, like. Yeah. And I always feel less of a man. Now I don't like. You know, I laugh at that. It doesn't make me go and like behave in any sort of way. I acknowledge it. I recognize it. It makes me laugh. Me and my wife joke about it all the time. But I recognize that pull. I recognize it from my youth when maybe I would have acted against that, or I would have hidden myself, or I would have done something differently. And I recognize it now as an adult. And I was just wondering if you guys had anything similar where society throws something up and it does make you feel less manly or less masculine or anything like that. Or is it just me?
I know what you're talking about. I've certainly had that in my life. I mean, I'm 50 now, and one of the benefits of that is that when you find yourself in those situations, which I do, and I'm like you know, I've not really done much in the way of like anything that traditionally would have been regarded as like manual, manly sort of labour in my career, you know. And I do find myself in those situations. I don't know if you know this app TaskRabbit, but I moved at the start of this year, and it's like Uber, but for people who do like odd jobs.
Okay, yeah.
And I was like, you wouldn't believe how trivial the jobs I was getting people to come around and do in my new house. Like, it's not like some sort of complex bit of plumbing. In the end, I was like, because you just see them, they're local and they're all like verified and have got reviews. You can go, oh, he'll come round and hang that big frame picture on my wall, which, to be honest, is just, you know, I mean, I do know you just drill a hole and stick a screw in, but I thought, I'll probably get it wrong and break it. So I've booked him to come around. My wife's like, and like, do IKEA furniture. And my mate said to me, "You're embarrassed by that?" And I said, "I would have been when I was younger, but I just like, there's things I can do that he can't do." And I just sort of own it. I go, thing is, I can't do it. And also, I can't be bothered learning. I'm quite lazy. I can't be bothered. That's the reason. And I'll tell the bloke, I go, "I'd rather pay you. I can't be bothered." Right? And so I found that quite empowering, because don't get me wrong, I have, when I was younger, felt in those situations with all those things, cars or DIY or various other bits and bobs, sport. Like, I love playing sport. You know, I've been out doing stuff this morning, and yet I am shit at most sports, right? So that's difficult, because some people are no good at sports, so they just don't do sport. Some people are good at it. I am rubbish, but for some reason I've always done it. So I've always was the last to get picked. I will still now, at my age, when I'm doing sport, I'll like muck up or humiliate myself. I just keep doing it. I think I've just got used to I just don't care. Do you know what I mean? And not caring is a big breakthrough for any bloke, but I can't say that I think that's just come with age, or like sort of aversion therapy of being humiliated and embarrassed that much, and then you just stop caring. So I'm familiar with the experience, but I'm just caring less and less as I get older. Yeah.
Sean, do you in day-to-day life ever feel that, like, that push and pull of you know, of like quote unquote masculinity or masculine traits? Or
Yes. So it's funny that you talk about DIY. DIY is something I feel like I should be able to know a little bit more. I think it's a great life skill in general, but I think it's something you usually attribute to being a guy. And interestingly enough, I like sport, I like exercise, but the idea, I think, of having a particular physique attributed to what it means to be a man, whether that's big biceps or abs or so much more, those are some of the ideas that I've struggled with. Because I think in the past, if I'm going to categorize it, I've struggled with body dysmorphia to some sort of degree. And you know, the longer you look at a fault is the more you find a problem with it. And that's something people don't really realize with the brain. I think another thing I've really struggled with is probably the idea of provision. Provision is a really big thing. When I talk to a lot of young boys, a lot of them feel like they have to financially provide, but I also ask them, what about emotional provision, mental provision, and spiritual provision? So those are some of the things that I've definitely struggled with, and I've, you know, my sense of self and where am I going to go? I should be at a particular point in my life. Those are some of the things I have really struggled with at times with being a man. But I don't think I feel as pulled. I definitely think I acknowledge it. I try not to let it become obsessive in my brain. And then I think one of the things I'm really trying to do a lot more of now is I think about life in a series of trade-offs. So economics at a core is trade-offs. It's what are you willing to trade? What are you willing to do? So for example, if I say that I want a particular physique, I might not be able to eat all the food that I really enjoy, right? But I make the trade-off that maybe I'll have a longer life. Maybe, and that's how I started to think about things. I think if I do more DIY, I won't be able to read as much or do as much as the other things that I really like to do. So yes, I definitely have struggled, but now I'm starting to think of everything as, if I do one thing, what can I lose out on, or what do I gain?
yeah, is the juice worth the squeeze?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So thinking a little bit about that then, I suppose, to move it more into the conversation around mental health, because masculinity does get, you know, people say, why is there a men's mental health crisis? Why are men killing themselves in certain demographics in record numbers? And people say, oh, it's because of masculinity. Well, that on its own means nothing, right?
Yeah.
So in your own experiences, you know, you've both spoken lots very publicly about your mental health. How does that kind of play out for you? Sam, I'll chuck it on your toes first, mate. How does this sort of, you know, what does the role of being in a man come into that?
I think there's two broad areas that I would say where that links specifically to this idea of masculinity. Number one is that a lot of men I speak to, and I've experienced this myself, are plagued by feelings of failure, right? And a lot of men who get into very dark places are often plagued by feelings of failure. But being a failure, a lot of that comes down to how you're measuring yourself. You know, there isn't a sort of really an objective sort of standard that all human beings need to, you know, conform to be considered success or failure. Of course, success and failure is not binary either. But if you have bought into, or you've been sort of bombarded with these traditional notions of masculinity, then you will measure yourself by them. And if you're not measuring up to these ideal standards around things like, it might be physical strength, it definitely with a lot of guys is about provision. That's a huge one with guys I speak to who fall into very dark places, who are maybe family men and feel like they're not doing enough, especially nowadays. It's so difficult to, you know, and even that is like, provide how? These are guys who might have a roof over their head. They might be putting food on the table every week. And they, you know, you meet guys, and it sounds daft, but, you know, I meet guys who are freaking out and falling into depressions because they haven't taken their kids on a holiday on a long haul flight or something, you know, which sounds like very first world problems. But these are the problems that a lot of, I believe everything's, you know, relative. And, you know, guys are absolutely, you know, subjected to feeling a failure on the basis of these things: financially, career-wise, ability to provide, strength, health, all of this stuff. And if you've bought in to the masculinity scam, then I believe you're setting yourself up for failure, because it will impose standards in very specific areas that it's very hard for most people to conform to and reach all at once. So you're setting yourself up for failure. So I would say that the good thing about rejecting that, which is very hard to do, it's not an easy thing to do for the reasons we've already touched on, rejecting that is about setting your own standards, right? Setting your own standards about what represents success and failure. And we should all have different ones. Do you know what I mean? You know, you should be working that out as you grow up. What do I really aspire to? Not what society thinks I should aspire to, not what my peers or marketing or anyone else. What do I want out of my life, right? So why don't we work that out? Well, partly, and this is the second thing about masculinity, is when you're growing up, you are so vulnerable to all of this pressure about being a man and what it means. And part of that is not sharing your feelings, not being outwardly sensitive, not discussing things. So therefore, you shut up, you play act, you don't share your feelings, right? That's a core part of being a bloke in this sort of conventional masculine world. So all of the problems, the little traumas, the bit of the frustration, the pain, it all grows and grows and grows inside of you because you've kept it under wraps for so long. And then you might hit an age where you've never shared any of this stuff. You've been chasing a standard of masculinity that has been set for you by other people, most of whom are trying to make money out of you one way or another, directly or indirectly. And then you hit a really dark place. You know, you're either drinking too much or taking drugs. That was what the crisis that hit me when I was in my late 30s. And I realise now, looking back, that was a gift to me. We'll get onto that, because it was kind of like the crisis forced me to confront all of this stuff. But it was brought about by a sense of frustration and failure. And it was notions of masculinity in two very big ways that had really contributed massively to me feeling like a failure. You know, that's it.
Yeah. What about yourself, Sean? With your experiences with your mental health over the years, how has the masculinity aspect, is that obvious to you? Is that something you were aware of at the time, or how does that kind of play into your experience?
It's really interesting. The more I've reflected on my old sense of self, I think similar to Sam, that when you're in dire straits, you're forced to confront parts of yourself you've been running from for a very long time. And the guilt and the shame that surrounds certain life decisions, falling into addiction for a series of years, really making careless decisions that I didn't care, frankly, about how other people really felt. I focused a lot more on myself and what I wanted. And I think during that time period, the behaviors that led me into a spiral were self-destructive behaviors, self-harm behaviors as I look back. And I think for me, so as I said, I've spoken openly about struggling with OCD and having particularly intrusive thoughts that a lot of people in the world do have, but they won't ever speak about. And I think some of the thoughts related to sexual assault and murder and so much more, compounded with the political climate where we have this assumption that all men by default are perpetrators, and they are the problem, absolutely. I think further compounded this internal sense of shame for me that I felt I couldn't come forward and talk about it because I would have to prove that I was innocent before guilty, if that makes sense. And that's my own internal world, but that's the way I've summed up the political landscape. I think also as well, one of the things I really struggled with speaking about my mental health was feeling like I should have things under wraps. I should have things relatively under control. And as I came out of my mental health crisis, it lasted for about 3 years. I was so broke, like I had no money. I remember credit cards, PayPal, chasing my tail. I remember I'd work at Lego and I'd hide behind the poles just so no one saw me because I felt so ashamed. So I used to model before that. And I felt like I'd fallen from grace. I think it's the best way to put it. You're around certain environments, you're around certain people that they inflate your ego. They give you a very insulated, unrealistic view of the world. Then to fall from grace and then to go back to a place where I felt like I'd never be again forced me to look at parts of myself. But it also made me realize that I'm better than nobody. Whereas I think when you're part of certain industries, you carry a certain ego, you carry a certain arrogance or bravado until that bubble is popped. So I definitely think being a man within certain aspects really forced me to challenge my mental health. But I think alongside that, the idea of being a man and opening up to people about your struggles seems to be like an allergy in some ways. That if you open up to some people, they'll weaponize it against you, or the fear that you won't be seen as manly enough anymore. I think it's something I really had a lot of thoughts about.
Yeah, because there's a lot in the mental health space in particular, isn't it? That seems to be, rightly or wrongly, what is talked about as like the crutch of everything, right? It's like, oh, if men just talked about stuff, everything would be all right. But, you know, is that the case? I don't think it's the case, but I don't know, like yes, it's important to talk about how you think and how you feel and get this stuff out, and it's important to ask for help, but to me, that's far too simplistic, right? That's like saying masculinity is the problem. All men have got to do is talk. Everything will be sorted, job done. It lets a lot of people off the hook. It lets the individuals off the hook. It lets a lot of societal issues off the hook, a lot of community issues off the hook. Yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that conversation? The vulnerability aspect of it. Do we need to, what needs to happen there?
I think that talking, sharing your feelings is actually, it's not as simple as that, but that is a representation of letting go of things like ego. That can be very toxic, and bravado can be toxic, and play acting a role, pretending to be someone you're not, pretending to be stronger or less bothered by stuff than you are. That is exhausting. That will wear you down. You will pay a price for that mentally and emotionally. So when people talk about being vulnerable, it's not just as soon as I sit and talk to you and tell you that I'm feeling down in the dumps, everything's going to go. But that's a representation. If I was able to tell you about the things I thought, the stuff I worried about, the weaknesses that I felt I had in certain areas of my life or my personality, that would be representative of the fact that I was able to let go of play acting as a tough guy or a perfect person all the time. And that in turn is extremely healthy, right? However, and I do think that's a big thing, because the other thing to remember is it is true that society has this terrible impact on us, but ultimately, we have control over ourselves, and we can't, although it's important to have these conversations and understand the way in which society works and all the scam of masculinity and all these toxic influences that are affecting us and our children. There's only so much we can do about that in the here and now. So for our own mental health, we can campaign maybe, but the best thing for your mental health is to sort of start working on yourself. Talking's an important part of that. However, I, as you can probably tell, have no problem talking about myself, talking about all this stuff. My wife says you talk about mental health too much, you've got mental health Tourette's, right? But that's me. That is me. That's where I am in my life. I feel able to do that. That is not everyone. So I do try to say it is good to talk, but don't feel like you have to, because if not, it's just a new thing to be guilty about, isn't it? It's another thing on top of everything else, right? So not only do I not have a six-pack or a big salary, I also am being told that I should make up for that by being able to talk, but I just can't find the words. I don't know how to. It feels like the worst thing. And I know people like that. Of course, there's loads of people like that. So it's very, very difficult. And I don't think we should shame men about their inability to share, because some guys just can't. I don't know what the rest of us can do to sort of, I suppose guys who can do it, all three of us here, I like to think that by us doing it publicly, that might help other people, you know, give people permission or make them feel a little bit more disarmed, or just learn some of the language or the thing. But yeah, I think sometimes I think, oh, it's a fine line between actually shaming someone about their inability to speak. But I do 100% believe in the power of being able to do that. You know, I know that it helps, but it's a shame if you can't do it.
Yeah, and you know, both those things, you know, the wonderful and frustrating thing about being a human is that you can hold competing truths, right?
Yeah.
So something can be really important and really difficult to do, and those two things can coexist as well, right? That's a wonderful thing. Sean, did you have to? You mentioned before about you know, being raised by women and having more sort of vocabulary around, you know, your emotions and things. Did you still have to learn to talk about your mental health and your experiences, or did it come naturally to you, or how did you find that process of opening up?
It's probably a little bit of both. My mum isn't the most vocal with how she feels. It's only as I've gotten older, I've started to understand my mum had a lot of troubles and had a lot of struggles. So I think for me, I went on my own journey through reading, through language, through analysing and watching other people, hearing my aunties who were very outwardly themselves. I started to listen and understand. And I think it's really pertinent to talk about something which relates to vulnerability. I think everyone wants a vulnerable man until they get a vulnerable man. And when they meet a vulnerable man that's open with his emotions, a lot of people can't handle it, whether that's men or women. And there's something called the vulnerability hangover, where when you talk about how you feel, afterwards you can feel really ashamed for doing that. Actually, you sit there and you think, what on earth have I just done? So it's also that double negative sometimes for a lot of people. And I do think men communicate and talk in ways that are different to most people. And I often have said that just because someone speaks in a language you don't understand doesn't mean they're not speaking at all. So for a lot of men, they are communicating, whether it's through copious drinking, whether it's through, you know, I made a joke, sucking on a flavoured stick to get through your day, vaping, whatever it could be, they are communicating, whether it's through silence, whether it's through coming home later. There's ways people communicate. It's just, I think we look for, and I've been guilty of this, I think when you go to therapy, you come out almost like a moral crusader. You want everyone else to go to therapy because you think it works. When I was vegan, I became like a vegan evangelist in many ways. It became like the new religion. I wanted everything to listen to. And that's what happens when ideas permeate you so much. You want to share it with the world. You want to share the so-called gospel in a non-religious way. So I think it's really important to understand that men do communicate in different ways. Some men, you know, the way they communicate is they want to be able to help their partner. That's a way that they feel useful. They feel like they've got purpose, and it's a way for them to feel like they've got a meaning in the world. And I think it's really interesting that growing up for me, seeing my mum provide in the ways that she did, I didn't have certain ideas of what it meant to be a man to provide until I was exposed to other people. Is when I realized, oh, okay, there's people that think quite differently from me. And my experience is quite privileged, really and truly, in that sense. So it's, as I said, everyone wants a vulnerable man until you get a vulnerable man. You have to be able to handle that man's vulnerability. And I truthfully don't think the world's ready for it. I think we talk about it all the time. We say masculinity is the problem. But if we look at systems, right, we talk a lot about systems. Patriarchy we define as we typically define it as men oppressing women. But if you take it out of a political context, patriarchy at its core just meant men hoarding resources at the top. That's all it was. It was economics, right? Because they had the physical strength to do it. There was a lot more they were able to do as a result of it. Now, if you think about resources, if I hold all these resources, I carry all this power, right? But heavy is the head that wears the crown. It's a substrata of men in society that have become so successful. They've been able to influence the way we all think about things in particular. But the people in the middle and at the bottom, and even some of the top, have become victims of the systems that they've created. So I think it's also important for us to look at the way we define masculinity, but look at the way we study history.
Yeah. definitely. I suppose the best way to predict the future is to learn from the past, right? Like,
Yeah, I think George Santayana said it best. Those who do not understand history are condemned to repeat it.
yeah, yeah. It's really interesting what you were saying then about men communicating even when they don't communicate, right? So I think about my own experience. I was very unwell for a long time, and I was just kind of like knocking about in my life while very, very ill. And I really, really wanted help, and I didn't know how to ask for that, and I didn't know what that could look like. And so I was acting in a way that someone would step in and save me, because I didn't think I could do it for myself. I didn't know I was doing it. I didn't wake up in the morning and say, right, how can I misbehave today to try and get someone to rescue me, right? But my behavior at times was quite unhinged. It was really, really out of character. But so we are constantly, where am I going with this? So it strikes to me that like some of these attributes of being a man that can be attached to masculinity in like a negative way or a toxic way, if we're using that word. Sometimes we're communicating that way and we're not getting our point across very well, a bit like how I'm feeling with this, where I'm going with this now. But sometimes we lean more into them, right? So when I was trying to get someone to come in and save me, that's what I had a lot of aggression. I'd cause situations, I'd smash things up, I'd lean into that side, all this like stuff that's typically associated. So, if we're communicating in that way, do you think that's like, again, is that underlying programming? Do we naturally drift to that when we run out of options? Or, because I don't know, it felt so natural to me. It came quite, and I think people can do that, right? It's just fall into this trap of being a horrible man. I mean, that's not really a question, but like...
I was going to say, that's more of a statement.
It's more of a statement, yeah. But how do you feel about that statement? Do you see anything in it?
I think it's important to say that some of the things I'm saying, they are generalizations for a reason. You have to study across the population. There's a lot of things within that's going to be wrong, but if I just use that as a blank template, men are more prone to violence because of testosterone. That evidence has been shown over and over again. That does not make it excusable. That it explains something. And I think that's really important to put out there as a preface or as a caveat. I think for a lot of men, they would rather watch the world burn as they burn it within themselves. And I've watched that quite happen with men of war. You look at Troy, for example, that the guy lost his girlfriend or wife to somebody else and he sent ships after her, right? I think quite often, some men internalize their problems. They might stop eating. Other men might go and smash things up and drink more. But the average is men are more prone to more violent tendencies or to do things that are more destructive. And there's often a really good question you can ask someone. And I suggest asking this on first dates or just asking it in general in your relationships. If the world was to see who you really were, would you end up in a mental prison or mental health hospital, or would you end up in prison? And the idea is that on one side, if you go to prison, you've externalized and damaged other things and other people. Whereas if you went to a mental health hospital, you're internally taking things out on yourself, if that makes sense. And I think quite often you see with a lot of young men that they're doing everything they can to externalize, but you're starting to see it happening more internally. And you're seeing that with the rates of body dysmorphia rising for a lot of young boys. You're looking at young boys, they're starting to have a lot more suicidal thoughts and a lot more suicidal ideation. I think times are changing.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think, can we attribute some of this stuff to a masculine ideal, or is it just, is it just a human struggling? Do you know what I mean? Is it just, so if ever in my life, I kind of lean more into masculine things, it's normally from a place of fear. If I'm going for an evening walk and there's a bunch of kids on the end of my road, and I'm thinking fucking hell, man, what's going to go on it? I don't live in a very nice place. Things like that happen all the time. And, that's when I kind of walk with a bigger walk. That's when I kind of try and make myself look bigger. That's when I lean into this masculine approach to that situation, right? So it's from a place of fear. So is it masculinity, or is it just if people are more well connected to themselves, if people know who they are, if people are more self-aware, if people are doing that inner work, then there's going to be less likely to play up in these ways that are attributed to masculinity and men being men?
I think it's worth saying that if there are elements of your personality that happened, or your behaviour that happen to overlap with, the sort of largely artificial notion of masculinity that is being peddled by Andrew Tate or whoever that might be, that you don't necessarily have to go the other extreme and think, oh my God, this is terrible, this is inauthentic, this isn't me, and also it's toxic, right? So if you're walking along the street and there is some people being intimidated and you feel sort of brave enough to kind of puff your chest out and convey to them the fact that you're not to be trifled with, that's not necessarily, you know, that's there's nothing more to that than like just being pragmatic and drawing that side of your personality out. If it's not defining you, it's not necessarily toxic. I think that, you know, just going back to that thing about how we communicate non-verbally, it is true. And I've got similar, you know, you made me think a lot just then in what you said about the way in which I acted when I was going through a bad period, particularly with addiction, where it was sort of like, you know, to use the cliche, it was sort of cry for help stuff. But the truth is I didn't understand that. I didn't understand my own emotions. I was not, to use the phrase that you used earlier, emotionally literate enough to understand. I didn't know the way I felt. I couldn't step back and look at it and think, are you all right, Sam? You know, what's going wrong? Are you exhausted? Are you feeling feelings of anger? You know, is that why you're drinking? I had no ability to reflect or analyse my own behaviour. I just didn't. And that was in part a result of, you know, notions of masculinity that had blocked me from ever showing any interest at all. That was the thing. Do not take yourself seriously. Do not be someone who spends too much time navel gazing or wrapped up in sort of introspection. Don't do that. That is, be more like, I don't know, Clint Eastwood, strong and silent. Don't, you know, or even if you're not going to be strong and silent, at least if you're going to be making noise, make it funny. You know, don't ever fall into the trap of making yourself look like as if you're taking yourself like a bit too seriously. As a result of being so hostile to any self-reflection, I found myself behaving a bit like, I was acting out all the time. I guess looking back, I was testing boundaries and waiting for someone to intervene, you know, until in the end it fell into a crisis and like, I had to effectively stage an intervention on myself because I was clear enough to see that if not, everything that I valued in my life was going to disappear pretty quickly. And therefore, you know, I had the gift of desperation that forced me to confront all of this stuff. So I was communicating through bad behaviour, drinking, drug abuse, blah, blah, blah. But I had no idea what I was communicating. Developing better emotional literacy is really important because you start to first see the way you're feeling, understand why you are feeling that way, know about positive, healthy ways you can adjust it and improve it, you know. And that starts with just rejecting that kind of idea of being a stoic male, having the balls to sort of reflect on yourself a little bit without being ashamed of doing so, and spending a long time learning about, you know, how you can change the way you feel in a positive way that doesn't involve getting twatted, you know, or whatever else it is you might do, going out and hitting someone with a pool cue, you know.
So if we're kind of thinking on this, you know, the scam of masculinity, right then, or as you're describing then, Sam, like choosing to kind of like opt out of some of those norms. But there must be reasons why we opt in, right? Like, what do we get out of it? Do you know what I mean? Like if it's marketing
fun.
and
I always say it's fun.
Yeah.
I was like a lad. I grew up being a lad. I was involved in lad culture. I was a scammer in as much as I, you know, was behind lad magazines, which were very successful back in the day, because it was a laugh, and it was and you know, my main thing was I didn't want to be bored, you know, and all of these things were fun and seemed accessible, and I don't really think that's not true now. There are certain elements of that sort of persona or that culture that can be toxic. But on the whole, there are certain elements of that kind of... But I would say people like just... I mean, obviously, we've done quite well to only mention Andrew Tate once so far. But that, you know, he's just, I guess, shorthand for a million other sort of scammers that are out there. I would say the problem to them, and this is just probably a generational thing, is that what I don't understand is that I find all of those blokes above all Jordan Peterson's saying, like, so boring and joyless. And that's the thing that I don't understand, is that I was attracted to a sort of a laddie culture and grew up in that. And I understand now that some of it was very unhealthy and some of it was toxic. But I can see what drew me to it, in that it was funny and it was all about having fun and having a laugh all the time. When I see anything from those guys, I just think, what are kids into now? Like, they're so boring and serious about everything, which is the opposite of the sort of thing that used to, you know, like, excite me and my peers when I was younger, you know. So I might be too old to even begin to fathom what's going on there. But, yeah, I think that those, you know, that in a superficial level, that kind of type of masculinity that I grew up around was a laugh, and it was, you know, and it formed bonds, and it was enjoyable. And I think, I don't know, I mean, young men get bored easily. I'm sure young women do as well. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, you probably work with young people. I don't know, boredom's an issue, and maybe some of this masculinity stuff that you know, people get drawn into is just because they find it exciting or thrilling. I don't know.
Yeah, because we must get something out of it, right? Because if opting out leads to like all these like wonderful things, why is no one opting out? Why is everybody opting in? Like, that's the, I don't know, Sean. What do you think? What do we get out of it?
First of all, what is navel gazing?
Well, you just like have you not heard that phrase?
Never in my life.
It's like sort of, I think it's based on that thing where you're just like, navel gazing is when your head's bowed, and it's a way of sort of referring to people who are too introspective and, and constantly self-pitying or self-analysing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarity. I needed that, because I was wondering. Look, I disagree with the idea that masculinity is a scam. I believe the application of masculinity within itself has become a scam. But you've needed men in the world to help take care of people. I don't think men are inherently bad. I think men are inherently good. And I think there's a lot of things that need to change, like any system. I think if you go with the idea that masculinity is a scam, you're telling young men the ideas that they've bought into are absolutely wrong and there's no benefits with it, right? And I think you touched on something really important, which was, it was enjoyable. It created a lads culture, it created banter, which is connection. Humans are inherently social creatures. Whether or not that culture is right or wrong, we buy into certain ideas because it creates a sense of belonging and inclusion. And I think, especially when we disagree with people, we fail to see that as part of the bigger picture. So, for example, Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, right? I think we laud too much at their feet. I've read Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, and I thought some of them lessons were great lessons. Keep your tidy your room. Don't disturb kids when they're skateboarding. There's a few chapters I took on. I was like, this is great. And critical thinking means that I have to think critically, even if ideas I vehemently disagree with. So I think the way that we apply the critical thinking, the knowledge to look at these particular ideas of masculinity I think it's haphazard, right? If we use that with the riots, for example, there's a particular idea that all these people that are right-wing are just simply racist. And again, that's too simplified. We have to explore, there's a lot more nuance in it. And I think in particular for a lot of young people that I work with it's their sense of place in the universe and how they feel like they belong. That's the big question that they've got. So for example, if I remember correctly, someone may have to fact check me, but for example, boomers own 60% of the housing market, if I'm correct. Like, all their money's in the housing market. Young people in this generation, houses are 12 times the average salary. Once upon a time ago, it was 3 times, right? Young men are dying at around 35. They're more likely to commit suicide. AI is causing like a bloodbath. Young men don't feel as inclined to go to war as they once did. Once upon a time ago as well, so as humans, I'm getting a little bit scientific, so forgive me, but as humans, we are inherently a hierarchical species. Right? So the idea of alpha male, I'll go back into in a minute, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in human society. We are labile with the way we do things. So as humans, as a hierarchical species, there's men on the top, there's men in the middle, and there's men on the bottom. Once upon a time ago, the men that we're wanting the world to burn now were pushed into other tasks in society, such as blacksmiths. They might have been put into the monastery and so much more. We've eradicated certain paths for people to go. And we've just left these men there and said, just do what you want with yourself. And that's what I'm seeing in particular. The men that perhaps aren't the most book smart or book savvy, some of the qualities we no longer appreciate, we've just left them and said, do with it what you will. And how can you not expect them to burn? Martin Luther King said it best, that riots are the language of the unheard. But we can accept that for some social justice causes, but not for the others. And I think what we're watching with young men right now is they are burning the world. But we're also constantly telling them that masculinity is wrong. I think if you are someone who likes men, whether you're gay, heterosexual, whatever it might be, I think a lot of people like certain masculine traits. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think some men like inherently maybe more feminine traits. And I think there's become now a war on what people like because we see it as all destructive. I think when you throw the baby out of the bathwater, when you kill the baby, don't you? Some ideas are still very important. And when I work with young men, what I seek to not do with them is to tell them the way they think is wrong. I seek to challenge them in the way that they think. So for example, I'm going to use an example I use, and forgive me, I'm going to put this out as a trigger warning. So a lot of kids agreed with Andrew Tate, right? They could accept that he had these rape charges, so much more, and human trafficking, but they were so enamored by all of what he was as an individual and all the presence he has. But then when I asked them about Mike Tyson, right? They love Mike Tyson, they love everything that he does, but Mike Tyson was charged with rape. Conor McGregor was charged with rape as well. And for a lot of these young men, they had an inability to discern the character from what they were doing and some of the things they did in their private life as well. And I think this is the way we have to kind of think about human beings, that we are fallible creatures, we make mistakes, boys, men make mistakes, but we have to seek to live in a culture of redemption. And I think when we go with the idea that masculinity is a scam, we don't let these young men have an ability to redeem themselves. Like, even if I disagree with certain notions, I think it's important to cook as a man. I think it's important to cook as a human. But it's one of the things I I'm massively proud of myself about. I don't want to be the kind of man that comes home and expects his wife to cook after she's had a long day at work. I think that's useless, right?
Yes.
But there's some people who, like, I don't want to expose some of my family, but there's some men who are, that's not important to them, right? So I think for me, we really have to criticize ideas without throwing out the people that have bought into the ideas, but give them a new way to think without demonizing them for what they do think. But as I said, a lot of what's going on with young boys is the language of the unheard. It really is, and I think that's the biggest issue we've got now. And I say it over and over again. I don't agree with certain things, but because I don't agree doesn't mean I can't listen, doesn't mean I can't work with people. And I think we live in this purity politics now, where you have to have the right views, you have to have the right ideas for people to want to work with you. And that's why we're seeing a lot of these men go to prison. We're seeing them kill themselves. We're seeing them go to, extreme lengths to be heard now. And I think we should judge society by how we feel it's most vulnerable. And I think a lot of these young men are extremely vulnerable, but we can't ask young men to be vulnerable if we're not ready for that vulnerability. If we're not ready for young men to tell us the ideas we don't agree with. Like, when I've worked with young men, some men believe women should be in the kitchen. Instead of me saying to them, that's wrong, tell me more. Help me to understand. That's an interesting perspective. Help me to understand a little bit more about that. Do you know what I mean? You have to explore more and to be curious with people. And this is why I say in my workshops, curiosity over condemnation, inquiry over inquisition, but also in a healthy space, you have to have dialogue that disagrees.
Yeah, very much so, mate. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. That kind of leads me to, I'm going to start to take us home a little bit, because I think we're in danger of going over. But I think if we...
Do you know the Arab came because Nasri saw that was the game now.
So, with that in mind, if we take it back to kind of like, I suppose, mental health and the conversation around men's mental health, this is a really big question to end on, but what needs to be done differently? What can we change? What's wrong with the messaging as it stands at the moment? What's wrong with what's available as it stands at the moment, that men are still taking their own lives in record numbers and we're blaming it on masculinity? But what needs to change within that? What could we do differently?
Well, like I said earlier, there's stuff that needs to change on a broad societal level, and I think you're right about, roles have changed for men, or roles have disappeared for men, and sort of having a role or a route in life that's clearly defined, a pathway that's defined, and that you have the opportunity to follow, like probably my father and grandfather's generation did. You take that away, then to a certain extent you're taking away people's opportunity to find sort of dignity and pride. And so I really agree with that. But that's a big undertaking. That's like linked into the economic systems we live in and all the rest of it. But I think that, from my point of view in the work I do around mental health, I'm sort of thinking a huge amount about what can you do. When you go through recovery, you learn a lot about, okay, what can I do? How can I keep my side of the street tidy?
Yeah.
Because sometimes in the depths of a mental health crisis, it's about getting up and putting one foot in front of the other. And therefore, while all of these other problems are entirely legitimate and do need addressing, sometimes it's like, I feel it's more helpful to tell guys what it is they can do to improve, or what we can do in a smaller way. I do think that I think that the more people who feel that they can talk, do talk, in order to show that there isn't necessarily, this isn't binary, there isn't a good way or a bad way to be a man. And I often say as well, you're not either this type of bloke, an Andrew Tate type of bloke, or a tough guy, or you're kind of like some sort of hippie over here. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? There's a million and one different types of person you can be.
You can be a few of them too, right?
You can be a few all at once, and that's cool. And it's very simple. If you are in the business of grifting, right, like these sort of masculinity influencers are, obviously ask anyone in any form of advertising or marketing or politics, that matter, give people a very simple choice, a simple thing to aspire to, right? Because that's very easy, right? So if you're Andrew Tate, you go, right, work out, buy a fast car, have sex with lots of women. How about that? And people go, yeah, I'll sign up for that if you're a young, vulnerable bloke. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there are a million and one different sorts of people you can be. And on a small and simple level, I think, anyone who feels that they can demonstrate that every day in a positive way to other men is playing a positive role.
I agree. Yeah, very much so. What about you, Sean, mate? What do you think we could do differently on any level, whether that's individual or at a community level or institutional level?
I think 3 simple steps in terms of people's interpersonal relationships with men. And I think it's easier to give people takeaways. So for me, I would say, if you want to hear a man talk, be prepared to hear things you don't want to listen to. Be prepared to hear things you don't agree with. Be prepared to hear things that are going to trigger you. If you really want someone to open up, that's step number 1. I think step number 2 is encourage them to look for support, but also be with them to help them look for that support. And I think for number 3, expose them to different ideas of what it means to be a man, right? So I often say this to people. If you're struggling to talk about mental health, for example, OCD, I tell people, take it out of the first person perspective and put it into the third person. It's easier sometimes for someone to relate to something when it's no longer about themselves. They can see things a little bit more objectively. So try and take another example, another case study, and ask that young man to look at it, tell me your views and so much more. And sometimes it can help them to start being a little bit more introspective. I also would say as number 4, I thought it was only supposed to be 3, but as number 4, take a man to somewhere where he's most comfortable. People usually will open up in places they're a lot more comfortable, but don't try and make it an agenda. I've been guilty of trying to make things an agenda before, and for some people it gets their back up against the wall. So that's something I'm also really realizing works. But as I say, if you really want to help men recognize your own archaic ideas of what masculinity is, and be open to having new ideas from men that perhaps you may not agree with. And I think it's been so fundamental in the work that I've done with people, because you have to apply a sense of unconditional love or unconditional acceptance. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, and I want to make that clear. You can disagree with someone, but I often say acceptance is the bridge where you meet somebody. And when you can meet them in a particular place, it's easier to convert them to a particular side, if that's what you really want to do.
Yeah, I love that, mate. Yeah, that was lovely. And I suppose just to chuck my 2 cents in, I think that something that's really, really important is to kind of to find out what exists in your own community and on your own doorstep, right? Because a lot of this, I think a problem, a lot of this, it takes place online, where we confuse Instagram reach with reaching actual people. And I think there are some incredible organizations that are doing incredible work in communities, and no one knows they exist because we're always signposting to the big five. And whoever they might be, they do wonderful, wonderful work, but they're okay. They've got the money, and it's these little groups, these groups of men that sit around in community centres on a Tuesday, or go for walks around a park, that don't have big followings and they don't have celebrities. They're changing lives and they're saving lives. And if we know that they're out there, how can we get involved in them? How can we support them? How can we sign people to them? So sometimes we try and think too big, and if we think a lot smaller, we can actually make a much bigger difference. So that's kind of where my thoughts on it are. Are we there for time, mate? Yeah, wonderful. So we'll wrap it there, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.